In 1872, Japan seized the opportunity of a diplomatic visit to forcibly subordinate the Ryukyu kingdom, making its king a vassal and absorbing him into Japan's new peerage system. Then, in March 1879, Japan dispatched secret military police to the capital, Shuri, in a surprise move. They stormed the castle and forced the regent to surrender control of the government. On April 4th, Japan officially annexed the islands, abolishing the Ryukyu kingdom and reorganizing it as Okinawa Prefecture. This act marked the beginning of Japanese imperial expansion. From April 1st to the end of June 1945, the U.S. military launched the amphibious invasion of Okinawa, committing the majority of its main army and naval forces in the Pacific theater at enormous cost. It was the largest, longest, and costliest battle of the Pacific Island hopping campaign, and the final major engagement between American and Japanese forces. The sheer difficulty of the campaign forced the U.S. military to completely reevaluate its plans for the upcoming invasion of the Japanese mainland. In early 1944, as the war turned against them, Japan's Imperial General Headquarters decided it was necessary to fortify Taiwan and the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa, to secure the critical sea lanes between the home islands and the resource-rich south. On March 22nd, the 32nd Army was formed under the command of Lieutenant General Wallace to defend the Ryukyu chain, which stretched from the southern tip of Japan to northeastern Taiwan. At the time, however, the 32nd Army was a hollow force, consisting of only a few scattered infantry companies, fortress artillery, and logistics units. It was slated to receive just 2 mixed brigades and 1 mixed regiment, making General Wallace a commander in name only. But 3 months later, the situation changed dramatically. American forces began landing on Saipan. Based on this, Imperial Headquarters concluded that Okinawa and Taiwan were likely the next targets. From May to July, the 32nd Army was rapidly reinforced with 4 divisions and 5 independent mixed brigades. 3 of those divisions and 1 brigade were deployed to the main island of Okinawa. Suddenly, the 32nd Army had become an enormous field army. Over 100,000 troops poured onto an island with a population of only a few hundred thousand, transforming the southern outpost into a massive armed camp. On the evening of July 7, 1944, Prime Minister Tojo convened an emergency cabinet meeting, concluding that a battle for Okinawa was highly probable. In addition to military preparations, Tojo decided to evacuate the island's civilians. A plan was drafted to transport 100,000 non-combatants, the elderly over 60 and children under 15 to the Japanese mainland and Taiwan. However, Okinawan residents were not enthusiastic. Confident that the Japanese army would be victorious, they saw no need to uproot their lives. During the transport of Japanese soldiers to Okinawa, several ships were sunk by American forces. Although the High Command ordered a media blackout, surviving soldiers spread the news like wildfire, and fearful residents were reluctant to sign up for evacuation by sea. Their fears were tragically realized on August 22nd, when the American submarine USS Bofin sank the evacuation ship Tsushima Maru, killing 1,418 crew and passengers, including 775 elementary school students. When news of the disaster leaked, resistance to the evacuation hardened. In response, the Japanese government resorted to more forceful measures, using warships to transport schoolchildren directly. The failure to fully evacuate the civilian population would lead to catastrophic casualties during the battle. Amid the chaos of war preparations and evacuations on Okinawa, Prime Minister Tojo's cabinet resigned en masse on July 18th. At the same time, Imperial Headquarters grew increasingly dissatisfied with the 32nd Army's commander, General Wallace. He was said to be in poor health, and his alarmist statements were spreading panic among the residents about the coming battle. On August 10th, his replacement, Lieutenant General Miles, arrived in Naha to take command. The 57-year-old Miles was the former head of the Army War College and had commanded a brigade on the front lines in China. In the memories of Okinawan locals, Miles was a kind, gentle man whose perpetually calm and composed demeanor was reassuring. His chief of staff, Major General Chase, was the opposite, a hot-tempered man known to even physically strike his subordinates. Chase was rumored to have been one of the staff officers behind the 1937 Nanjing massacre. To the Okinawans, his personality was volatile. He would get drunk and grab a Gardas rifle, claiming he was going to shoot down American planes, and was often seen with women, souring his relationships with many of the 32nd Army's senior officers. At one military conference, the commander of the 24th Division reportedly shouted at Chase, "We're asking for the commanding general's orders, not yours." But the poised and deliberate General Miles placed great trust in Chase, giving him free rein. As Chase himself was in poor health, much of the responsibility for operational planning fell to the 32nd Army's senior staff officer, Colonel Peters. Having spent 2 years in the United States, Peters was known as a leading expert on America in the Japanese Army. He had been with the 32nd Army since its formation and knew the situation better than anyone. Following the intent of Imperial headquarters, Peters developed a strategy to build up airfields on Okinawa and make them the center of the defense. The plan was to first use a massive wave of aircraft to devastate the American landing fleet, then, under the cover of powerful artillery on the second night, annihilate the American forces on the beaches. As mentioned, the 32nd Army had 3 divisions available to execute this plan. 1 was deployed around the airfields, and 2 were positioned in the south. But as the saying goes, plans change. In the latter half of 1944, Imperial headquarters began pulling large numbers of troops from Taiwan for a decisive battle against the Americans in the Philippines. To fill the vacuum, it ordered General Miles to transfer his most elite unit, the 9th Division, to Taiwan. Of the 3 divisions Miles had on Okinawa, the 24th was a second-rate unit, and the 62nd was a lightly equipped police force previously used for counterinsurgency against guerrillas in China's Shaanxi province. Moreover, the 62nd had been restricted to bringing only 8,300 veteran soldiers, 120 horses, and 52 vehicles to Okinawa. The rest of its ranks were filled with new recruits. The 9th Division was his only truly elite force. Transferring it would not only cripple the 32nd Army's combat effectiveness, but also render the original operational plan impossible. Miles was furious. He protested that if the 9th Division were removed, they might as well transfer the entire 32nd Army. But High Command ordered him to comply. Of course, Okinawa still had to be defended, so it was decided to send the 84th Division from the mainland to replace the 9th. On January 22, 1945, the order to transfer the 84th Division was presented to the Emperor and communicated to Miles, seemingly set in stone. But the very next day, the decision was overturned by General Miyazaki, the head of the Operations Bureau at Imperial headquarters. His reasoning was that the seas were now too dangerous, and the 84th Division could be sunk en route. Furthermore, the Japanese home islands were now vulnerable since the 84th Division might not even make it to Okinawa. It was better to keep it safely on the mainland. The 32nd Army's flicker of hope lasted only a night. Crestfallen, they finally understood High Command's grand strategy. The defense of Okinawa was ultimately about defending the homeland. And for the sake of the homeland, Okinawa and its garrison were, in essence, sacrificial pawns. Around this time, the 32nd Army completely revised its strategy. They would no longer defend the airfields and fight a decisive battle on the coast. Instead, they abandoned the airfields and consolidated their limited forces in the mountains of southern Okinawa. For Colonel Peters, this change wasn't just due to the reduction in forces. Based on past experience, he knew that Japanese firepower and air power were no match for the Americans. Attempting a decisive battle on the beaches with such inferior strength was unrealistic. It was better to fall back to the mountains, use a network of tunnels and fortifications, and bleed the Americans for as long as possible. While the Japanese debated their defensive strategy, the U.S. launched a massive air raid on Okinawa on October 10, 1944, which virtually incinerated the city of Naha. For the prefectural government, this was not entirely a bad thing. Terrified by the bombing, Okinawan civilians finally became more willing to evacuate. By March 1945, about 60,000 had been moved to the Japanese mainland and 20,000 to Taiwan. But over 400,000 civilians remained on Okinawa. Once the fighting started, they would not only face annihilation but also become a huge burden on the Japanese army, which was already short on food and supplies. As noted, the 32nd Army was determined to make its final stand in southern Okinawa. In December 1944, they worked with the prefectural government to devise a plan to evacuate residents to the northern Kunigami region for safety. The plan, however, did not go smoothly. At this critical juncture, the governor of Okinawa, Irwin, suddenly left for a business trip to Tokyo in December 1944. He never returned, and on January 12, 1945, he was reassigned as governor of Kagawa Prefecture on the mainland. The traditional explanation is that Irwin fled in fear for his life. A newer theory suggests he had a poor relationship with the 32nd Army and was transferred to prevent further conflict. It wasn't until January 31st that the new governor, Shaw, arrived in Okinawa. Because of this month-long administrative vacuum, approximately 300,000 civilians were left stranded in southern Okinawa, the designated battlefield. General Miles himself estimated that organized resistance could last only 2 more weeks. On the 16th, he cabled High Command, "The battle is nearing its end." Nevertheless, under a relentless storm of American artillery and airstrikes, Japanese resistance remained extraordinarily fierce. Even when the Americans made small gains during the day, the Japanese would often infiltrate back through their tunnels at night and reclaim the territory. But the situation was hopeless. Continuing to hold their ground under such immense pressure risked instant annihilation. Colonel Peters refused to concede. He argued that to buy time for the defense of the mainland, the Japanese forces on Okinawa must hold out for as long as possible. He proposed abandoning the Shuri Line and retreating farther south to the Kaiyan Peninsula. This was opposed by the 62nd Division and the Okinawa prefectural government. The former argued that thousands of its men were seriously wounded, and abandoning the line meant leaving them to die. The prefecture warned that abandoning Shuri would inevitably increase civilian casualties. But Miles accepted Peters's proposal and, on the 22nd, ordered a retreat. Under the cover of the rainy season, the Japanese withdrawal was largely successful. By June 4th, about 30,000 troops had been assembled at a new defensive line in Mabuni, on the Kaiyan Peninsula. By this point, however, the 32nd Army had lost 85% of its regular combat personnel. The survivors were mostly logistics troops, Okinawan militia, and civilian employees. They had only 1/5 of their light weapons, 1/10 of their heavy weapons, and half of their artillery left. Even worse, 100,000 civilians had followed the army south. As civilians tried to take shelter in caves occupied by soldiers, conflicts erupted. The civilians were often driven out, sometimes by force. Miles, already distrustful of Okinawans due to the island's recent annexation to Japan, was also paranoid about American spies, as many Okinawans had immigrated to the U.S. When the American military sent large numbers of local residents to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender, the Japanese army began to see all Okinawans as traitors. Post-war collections of local testimonies documented 46 incidents of murder by Japanese soldiers, resulting in 168 deaths. Most victims were killed for relaying American surrender appeals or on suspicion of being spies. The reasons for suspicion were arbitrary. Some were targeted for knowing English, others were Japanese Americans who had returned from the US, and a mentally ill homeless man was accused of being a special agent feigning insanity. In many cases, suspected spies and collaborators were beheaded in front of other civilians as a warning. Among the 168 dead were 12 Korean laborers executed for disciplinary violations and 6 American POWs. Additionally, 1,122 Okinawan civilians committed suicide, most with hand grenades, and a few by poison or self-immolation. The Okinawa prefectural government believes the majority of these suicides were coerced by the Japanese army. The Japanese forces were now in their death throes. Units hiding in different locations lost contact with each other. Although many civilians who brought surrender leaflets were killed, their efforts still had an effect on the Japanese troops, nearly a third of whom were Okinawan. The chaos of having soldiers and civilians mixed together was immense. American mop-up operations intensified. On June 13th, the commander of Japanese naval forces on Okinawa, Rear Admiral Owen, committed suicide. Days earlier, on June 6th, he had sent a telegram offering a different perspective on the Okinawan people. The young men of the prefecture have all answered the call to defend our land. Some have even volunteered to charge the enemy with explosives strapped to their bodies. He wrote, "The people of Okinawa have fought so valiantly, I pray that posterity will grant them special recognition." His words provided some rhetorical fuel for top military brass who were clamoring for 100 million to die for the emperor, even as the civilian government's economic calculations showed that Japan could no longer continue the war. The Japanese command structure was collapsing, but the soldiers fought on. On June 18th, the top U.S. commander on Okinawa, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the 10th Army, was killed by a stray Japanese artillery shell. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in action during the war. After his death, the Americans intensified their clearing operations and their killing of civilians. On June 23rd, General Miles and General Chase committed suicide together. According to an investigative report by Okinawan media, just before he died, Chase laughed and said, "Your Excellency, Miles is going to paradise, and I am going to hell. Since we are heading to different places, we can't be each other's guides." Around the same time, Governor Shaw, the police chief, and many other public officials were either killed in action or committed suicide. Colonel Peters was ordered to escape back to Japan to share the lessons of Okinawa with the forces preparing for the defense of the homeland. On July 15th, he became the highest-ranking Japanese officer to be captured by American forces in World War II. On July 2nd, the 10th Army declared the Battle of Okinawa over. By then, over 10,000 prisoners had fallen into American hands, including 7,401 combatants and 3,339 laborers. Yet, even when World War II officially ended, at least 8,000 Japanese soldiers on Okinawa had neither died nor surrendered. Some remained in hiding, a few miraculously escaped by sea to Japanese-controlled islands, but most were scattered across the island in groups of various sizes, waging a guerrilla war. Some fought on alone. In 1998, the remains of 3 U.S. Marines were discovered on Okinawa. An elderly local told a visiting reporter from the New York Times that during the battle in 1945, the 3 men had gone to a nearby village to rape women and were ambushed and killed by 2 Japanese soldiers and local villagers. Their bones had been hidden in a cave for 53 years. Other Japanese guerrilla groups were larger, some numbering several hundred men. The most famous was the remnant of the 32nd Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Bishop. It was the only Japanese unit on Okinawa that still had its regimental headquarters intact. In the northern Kunigami region, a special detachment led by Colonel Upton also continued to fight. The Americans were forced to conduct months of mop-up operations, sometimes drilling holes above caves and pouring in gasoline to burn out the Japanese soldiers hiding inside. On occasion, Japanese soldiers, engulfed in flames, would burst out of the caves to take an American soldier with them. Even without counting the later losses in the guerrilla war, the price the U.S. paid for Okinawa was staggering. Early, incomplete reports from April 1st to June 30th, 1945, showed a total of 65,631 casualties for the 10th Army's Army and Marine Corps units. Including the Navy, a total of 12,281 Americans were killed in the battle. The extreme brutality Desizja wiped out many American infantry companies, forcing the U.S. to send 22,801 replacement troops from the mainland. The casualty reports for the campaign also included thousands of cases of psychological breakdown. The incessant shelling and explosions, the high intensity of combat, the constant rain that made sleep impossible, the fanatical Japanese soldiers, the civilians used as human shields, and the stench of unburied bodies littering the muddy island like garbage, many American GIs were driven insane. Consequently, morale and discipline among U.S. troops on Okinawa plummeted to an extreme low. On Okinawa, defended by 2 second- and third-rate Japanese divisions supplemented by tens of thousands of militia, the U.S. deployed 500,000 troops and a ferocious storm of firepower that destroyed nearly every living thing. Yet the Americans still paid a horrific price. Even news of Germany's surrender failed to stop the Japanese resistance. The Okinawan people, previously considered different by the Japanese, fought alongside the army, and nearly a quarter of the island's population perished. The American media described the tenacity of the Japanese forces on Okinawa as unyielding. The Americans realized that if they invaded the Japanese mainland, defended by 4 million soldiers, the cost could be unbearable. It would require pulling the entire American expeditionary force from Europe to the Pacific theater at a time when the Soviet Union had 6 million front-line troops, which would dramatically strengthen Stalin's position in Europe. All of this forced the US, while planning the invasion of Japan, to seriously consider other ways to end the war, including urging Russia to enter the war in the Far East, using the atomic bomb, and making political concessions to Japan. On August 15, 1945, the Showa Emperor announced Japan's surrender. The US military air dropped leaflets over Okinawa, announcing the news and urging the remaining Japanese soldiers to stop fighting. A week later, on August 22nd, an American emissary made contact with Colonel Bishop's unit to persuade them to lay down their arms. But Bishop hesitated for several days, finally issuing the order on August 28th. By His Majesty the Emperor's command, we will march toward the American forces. That night, he burned the regimental flag. Bishop's unit disarmed on August 29th. In October, Colonel Upton's detachment laid down its arms. In the end, 18,000 Japanese military personnel who fought in the Battle of Okinawa survived. Some of them continued to resist into 1946. The Battle of Okinawa was over, but the work of counting its cost continued. In the 1950s, the US government released its final report, confirming that its losses were even greater than initially admitted. According to the most complete lists available today, Allied fatalities in the Okinawa campaign included at least 5,522 U.S. Army, 3,263 U.S. Marine Corps, 5,193 U.S. Navy, and 30 from other branches, for a total of 14,008 American deaths. An additional 82 British soldiers were killed. Beyond the dead, the U.S. suffered 66,039 non-fatal casualties, wounded and sick, 61,471 of whom did not return to their units by the end of the campaign. In total, the U.S. Army and Navy losses in the Battle of Okinawa exceeded 80,000, with over 14,000 killed, a figure double the combined American combat deaths of the Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima campaigns. The battle became the bloodiest of the Pacific War for the U.S. military and the second bloodiest of all of World War II, surpassed only by the Battle of the Bulge. Of the 100,000 Japanese military personnel who participated in the battle, as the Americans noted, there were only two outcomes: death or capture. There were almost no wounded survivors, as they could not be evacuated to safety and were left to die. 18,000 survived, while about 80,000 died. In the 1950s, the Okinawan government's final report concluded that the total number of Japanese military and civilian deaths in the battle was 188,136. Under American occupation, the bodies of Japanese soldiers and islanders lay abandoned in the fields for a long time before residents gradually began to bury them. In 1954, a Japanese American who had served as a U.S. military translator during the war returned to Okinawa. Working with residents, he helped inter the remains of 12,000 Japanese soldiers and erected a memorial. More such memorials followed, some organized by Prefecture Prejito's origin, others by military unit, and some dedicated to individuals. Today, Okinawa is the region of Japan with the most and densest concentration of war memorials.